identify for P64. Okay. I'm trying to cheat and look out there. I think I see my crater. Oh, baby. I'm not sure. Coming through 7. Look at P64, Pete. P64. That's it. There's LPD.
Roger, copy P64.
1000 update. Hey, there it is. There it is. Son of a gun. Right down the middle of the road. Outstanding. 42 degrees, Pete. Hey, it's targeted right for the center of the crater. Look out there. I can't believe it. Amazing.
During the November 1969 flight of Apollo 12, NASA's official historical record has always told us that Mission Commander Charles Pete Conrad and Lunar Module pilot Alan Bean touched down at their lunar landing site known as Statio Cognitium, which is located on the eastern edge of Oceanus Procellarum, or the Ocean of Storms. And from NASA's official storyline, we are told that the pair of astronauts conducted 2 EVAs on the lunar surface during their 31.5-hour stay on the moon.
And that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me.
Today we will examine some very relevant NASA archive evidence related to this flight, and I will demonstrate to you that NASA's official claim that only 2 EVAs took place during the Apollo 12 mission is a lie. Thankfully for us, a few years ago, NASA actually slipped up and they got a little sloppy with their sanitizing and censorship protocols, resulting in the space agency accidentally publishing classified information within an unclassified public archive document, confirming the fact that astronauts Conrad and Bean did indeed conduct not 2, but 3 EVAs during the Apollo 12 mission. Back in September of 2006, an analysis was published in the NASA archives that was titled The Apollo Experience, Lessons Learned for Constellation Lunar Dust Management. And this document, as its title suggests, deals with examining lunar dust management issues that were experienced throughout the course of the 6 declared Apollo lunar landing missions, highlighting concerns that need to be recognized and evaluated in order to better aid in preparation for any potential future missions to the moon. On page 9 of this document, under the header of Surface Obscuration During Descent, Observations, we discover this rather interesting paragraph that slipped past the NASA censors. The blowing dust caused by the Apollo 12 LEM landing appears to have been worse than that of Apollo 11. In fact, a stand-up extravehicular activity was performed by the crew to assess the site prior to performing lunar surface EVAs because blowing dust completely obscured the view during landing. Now, if you have even a basic appreciation of the Apollo 12 mission's publicly declared lunar surface events timeline, you can look at this paragraph and see that something is very clearly amiss here, because, at least according to the official historical record that you've always been fed by NASA in the past, there was no stand-up EVA conducted during the Apollo 12 mission. Yet this NASA document, published a few short years ago in their public archives, directly references this event that occurred back in November of 1969, blatantly admitting that it did indeed happen. First off, it's important to establish that what you see here cannot be explained away as a simple misprint or an accidental typo of some kind. This document does not merely just acknowledge that a stand-up EVA did take place during the Apollo 12 mission, but in essence, it provides us triple confirmation of this fact, revealing not only that this SEVA did indeed occur, but also briefly declaring when they did it and why they had to do it. And the inclusion of those 3 key related points within this one paragraph rules out the possibility that what you're seeing here can be accounted for or explained away as being a simple erroneous misprint of some kind. The only Apollo mission to ever officially confirm that they conducted a stand-up EVA was the Apollo 15 flight to the Hadley-Rille Marsh of Decay region in July of 1971, and this document is clearly not mistakenly referencing that declared event. As you can see, this paragraph clearly provides a reason as to why they did this SEVA during Apollo 12, stating it was because blowing dust completely obscured the view during landing. This means that the Apollo 12 SEVA was executed in response to something that happened during the landing phase of the mission and was not a part of the publicized pre-mission flight plan. The Apollo 15 SEVA, on the other hand, was publicly pre-planned prior to launch, so we can state categorically that the Apollo 15 SEVA, the only declared SEVA during the Apollo program, had nothing to do with dust issues experienced during landing because NASA told the world they were going to do it before that mission ever even left Earth. What you're actually seeing here is an example of an accidental leak of classified information that slipped past the NASA DoD document sanitizing and censorship team and then was openly, though unintentionally, published within this unclassified 2006 Public Archive document. Throughout the course of this presentation, we're going to be digging deeper into this stunning NASA deception, and you will see that there is indeed significant supporting evidence in the NASA archives that will allow me to demonstrate to you that what this paragraph claims is most definitely true, that an off-the-record SEVA absolutely was covertly conducted during Conrad and Bean's November 1969 mission to Stadio Cognitium. Before going any further, I think it's important that we make sure that everyone appreciates the distinction between a moonwalk EVA and a stand-up EVA. So first we'll take a quick look at exactly what the differences between those two extravehicular activity types are. It's important for us to remember here that the Grumman lunar modules used throughout the Apollo program did not utilize airlocks to allow the astronauts to conduct EVA operations. They instead had ingress-egress hatches, a pair of hatches on each lunar module in fact. The hatch the astronauts used after landing on the moon in order to get from the interior crew cabin of the LEM down to the lunar surface so that they could conduct their moonwalks was a quadrangle hatch that was located on the forward, or what was in NASA speak known as the +Z side of the spacecraft. When the astronauts were inside the LEM on the lunar surface and wanted to conduct a moonwalk, they would first don their spacesuits and then put on and connect themselves to their PLIS backpacks, the Personal Life Support System backpacks, which contain the astronauts' primary and emergency O2 breathing supplies and CO2 scrubbers, water tanks to feed their liquid-cooled LCVG underwear they wore to prevent hyperthermic overheating, as well as the radio communications gear that allowed them to talk to each other and mission control in Houston when they were outside on the lunar surface. After donning the pressure suits and their PLIS packs, they would then put on their pressure helmets, EVA helmet visor assemblies, and EV pressure gloves, and pressurize their spacesuits with O2 directly from the PLIS backpacks. And once that was done, they depressurized the crew cabin of the lunar module using a dump valve on the inside of the hatch to evacuate the roughly 4.6 psi internal atmospheric pressure inside the LEM until it equalized with the near vacuum external environmental conditions out on the lunar surface. They then cracked open the +Z hatch, and once that inward opening quadrangle hatch was ajar, the astronauts, one at a time, would then crouch down and back their way out of the spacecraft feet first, moving out onto the porch area of the LEM, still some 12 feet above the Lorraine, before finally descending the 9-rung ladder down to the lunar surface to actually start getting their feet dirty in the regolith. The second hatch on the LEM was the circular overhead docking hatch located on the top, or what was called the +X side of the spacecraft. And this hatch was the one which the command service module would dock with and remain attached to during the translunar injection, translunar coast phases of the mission, as well as during on-orbit operations above the moon, prior to LEM separation and powered descent or after lunar rendezvous. And this +X topside overhead hatch was primarily used during the Apollo program for transferring crew and equipment between the LEM and the CSM when the two craft were docked in space. But when the LEM was down on the lunar surface after landing, this +X overhead hatch could be, and occasionally was, used for conducting stand-up extravehicular activities. Prior to conducting an SEVA like Conrad and Bean did covertly during Apollo 12, the two astronauts would be first geared up in their spacesuits as if they were conducting a moonwalk, but they did not need to take time donning and then connecting themselves to their bulky PLIS life support backpacks. And the reason for this is because the circular shape and dimensions of the +X overhead hatch that they would be using to conduct the SEVA through did not really permit an astronaut who was wearing an obtrusive square backpack to pass through it. It was like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. And incidentally, this is the reason that the other hatch, the +Z forward hatch, was a quadrangle hatch instead of a circular one, to allow an astronaut wearing a PLIS backpack to safely ingress or egress through it. Because the +X overhead hatch was circular, however, the astronauts conducting an SEVA would instead use a set of hoses that kept their spacesuit oxygen and cooling water connections attached directly to the LEM's internal ECS, the environmental control system of the spacecraft. So when conducting an SEVA, the astronauts' spacesuits were actually drawing their O2 and cooling water directly from the LEM, and their radios were tied directly to the LEM comm system, so no bulky PLIS backpack was required. That is an important point to recognize here because during the Apollo program, the standard operating procedure for landing on the moon actually required that the two astronauts already be wearing their pressurized spacesuits, with their helmets and gloves on and their suits connected via the hosing to the LEM's internal O2 and cooling water supplies. And this was actually a safety protocol in the flight plan that was done throughout the Apollo program. And the reason they did this was just in case during landing they were to have an off-nominal touchdown on the moon that somehow resulted in the lunar module's very thin-skinned aluminum alloy pressure vessel suffering a hull breach of some kind. So it was a common sense safety measure to already have the astronauts fully geared up in their pressurized spacesuits inside the LEM before they landed on the lunar surface. Of course, this means that during Apollo 12, when Conrad and Bean touched down at Statio Cognitium, both of them were already essentially in SEVA configuration. They were wearing their complete pressurized A7L spacesuits and were already hooked up to the LEM's oxygen and cooling water supplies via the life support hoses. So shortly after landing, once the decision to conduct the covert SEVA had been finalized, Conrad and Bean did not have to go through the time-consuming task of trying to covertly don their spacesuits and pressurize them and make sure all the requisite internal LM ECS hosing connections had proper fit and function. All those required steps had already been done while in lunar orbit prior to powered descent initiation even beginning. So Conrad and Bean were already essentially good to go for their SEVA when they landed. They did not need a lot of extensive prep time for it after touchdown. They just had to don their EV gloves and leave a helmet visors. And that time-saving factor is a very big deal if you're going to be doing something like a clandestine SEVA shortly after landing, where your goal is to try to keep both the preparation for it and execution of it completely off the public record. The fact that Conrad and Bean were already essentially configured for stand-up EVA ops when they landed at Statio Cognitium meant they needed to develop less of a cover story to hide their preparation for it. When it came time to actually conduct their covert SEVA, Conrad and Bean used one of the hatch dump valves to evacuate the internal LEM atmospheric pressure, just as they would do as final prep for a moonwalk EVA. Commander Conrad then reached over his head and cracked open the overhead plus X hatch, swinging it inward on its hinges, where it was latched and locked in the full open position. And due to the dimensions of the plus X hatch, only one astronaut at a time could take in this impressive view of their landing site from the roof of the LEM. First, Commander Pete Conrad and then Lunar Module pilot Alan Bean, one at a time, would step up and stand on the engine cover for the Ascent Propulsion System, the APS, that sticks up from the floor in the center of the LEM crew cabin, so it was much like standing on a bench or a low table. And this allowed them to gain enough height to poke their upper body out through the plus X overhead hatch and let them take in the full 360-degree panoramic vista from the roof of their spacecraft over 7 meters above the Lorraine. This excellent high ground viewpoint atop the LEM allowed Conrad and Bean to take in the lay of the land and have a good look around at the Statio Cognitium site, getting their bearings and allowing them to identify their exact touchdown location, and of course take plenty of photographs with the Hasselblad 70mm HDC camera as well. And those film magazines, because they were exposed during a covert, off-the-record SEVA, were never publicly declared or cataloged after the mission, so the public has been denied that Apollo 12 SEVA imagery, and it remains classified top secret to this day. After both Conrad and Bean had finished their SEVA tasks atop the LEM, they then descended back into the crew cabin, closed and latched the plus X overhead hatch, and then commanded the LEM's ECS to repressurize the spacecraft, effectively completing their first and entirely off-the-record journey outside the pressurized security of their lunar module. So we can go back to that 2006 Lunar Dust Management document where NASA accidentally admits to one taking place during Apollo 12, and we can now examine and verify the accuracy of the very clearly stated claim that the reason this SEVA was conducted was because blowing dust completely obscured the view during landing. And verifying this point is important because it further demonstrates that everything this paragraph claims is accurate and does indeed fit the available historical record evidence of the Apollo 12 mission. One of the major goals of the Apollo 12 mission, and realistically it could be considered the primary public goal of this mission, was to demonstrate that the Grumman-built Apollo lunar module possessed a precision site targeting, approach, and touchdown capability. During the previous Apollo 11 first lunar landing mission a few months prior to Apollo 12, the goal had simply been for Armstrong and Aldrin to land the LEM safely, targeting a predetermined 4.8 kilometer wide by 18.8 kilometer long landing ellipse in the Sea of Tranquility that was known by the NASA pre-flight location identifier of landing site number 2 for mission G. And due to several reasons, during the first lunar landing of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong actually ended up landing the LEM about 6 kilometers downrange and cross-range of the pre-planned touchdown point, almost outside of the designated landing ellipse. So, while Neil Armstrong was afforded somewhat wide latitude in regards to exactly where he chose to land the LEM during the Apollo 11 first lunar landing mission, Apollo 12 Commander Pete Conrad, on the other hand, had been tasked with attempting a precision pinpoint landing in the Ocean of Storms, very close to the unmanned Surveyor 3 lunar probe, which had been autonomously soft-landed 2.5 years earlier at Stadio Cognitium, and was now sitting dormant just inside the eastern rim of a 250-meter diameter surface feature that had been aptly named Surveyor Crater. For the lunar landing of Apollo 12, Conrad's pre-flight goal was to bring their LEM, which had the radio call sign Intrepid, down within an area unofficially dubbed Pete's Parking Lot, a spot some 1,200 feet northeast of Surveyor Crater, but still within an easy moonwalk's distance across the Lorraine. And this range figure was selected as it was deemed to be far enough away from the Surveyor 3 that the fine particulate matter picked up and scattered around by the exhaust from the lunar module's DPS engine during descent would hopefully not be projected the distances required to reach out and dust over and contaminate the unmanned lander. As the astronauts made their final approach and descent into the Stadio Cognitium site, surface debris in the Pete's parking lot area forced Conrad to move the landing point designator and aim the velocity vector for a smoother landing spot northwest of Surveyor Crater instead. And as the altitude dwindled and they got close to the surface, the limited western-facing only field of view from the LEM window that Conrad was being afforded of the Lorraine below then quickly became badly obscured due to a phenomenon known as regolith entrainment, which is what happens when the lunar module is low enough that its descent propulsion system exhaust plume begins to interact with the lunar surface in the low-gravity, near-vacuum conditions, violently disturbing the regolith and kicking up a huge dust cloud like a man-made lunar sandstorm.
2, okay. Start the clock. 42 feet coming down at 2. 40 coming down at 2. Looking good. Watch the left. 31, 32, 30 feet. Coming down at 2 feet. You got plenty of gas, dude. Hang in there.
30 seconds.
18 feet coming down at 2. He's got it made. Come on in there. 24 feet. Contact light.
Roger, copy contact.
Prod. Pro. Yeah, pro. Okay. Inform off. Okay. I'll cycle these valves. You got your engine command override off.
This poor visibility on final descent resulted in Conrad flying the LEM so that it came to a rest right on the outside northwestern rim of Surveyor Crater, dangerously close to the crater lip and some 600 feet nearer to the Surveyor 3 lander than originally planned. Because of the dust issues combined with the essentially western-facing down-sun orientation of the LEM during both the approach and final vertical descent phases, Conrad was unaware of how close he was to Surveyor Crater at touchdown. During final descent and touchdown, Surveyor Crater was actually behind the LEM, out of Conrad's western-facing field of view, and the blowing dust beneath the lunar lander in fact reduced visibility so badly that Conrad was forced to shift his gaze away from the window and fly the 8-ball for the final seconds before lunar contact, landing the LEM in the blind using cockpit instrumentation alone. Let's let Commander Pete Conrad from Apollo 12, in his own words, describe these regolith entrainment issues he had to deal with as he piloted the lunar module Intrepid down into the Stadio Cognitium site.
Man, oh man, Houston, I'll tell you, I think we're in a place that's a lot dustier than Neil's. The good thing we had a simulator, because that was an IFR landing.
In NASA's Apollo 12 post-flight technical crew debriefing documentation that was published December 1st of 1969, I'll quote Commander Pete Conrad directly here. As soon as I got the vehicle stopped in horizontal velocity at 300 feet, we picked up a tremendous amount of dust, much more than I had expected. It looked a lot worse than it did in the movies I saw of Neil's landing. I could see the boulders through the dust, but the dust went as far as I could see in any direction and completely obliterated craters and anything else. The dust was bad enough and I could obtain absolutely no attitude reference by looking at the horizon and the LEM. I had to use the 8-ball. I had attitude excursions in pitch of +10 and -10, which happened while I was looking out the window making sure that the lateral and horizontal velocities were still nulled. I would allow the attitude of the vehicle to change by + or -10 degree in pitch and not be aware of it. I had to go back in the cockpit and keep re-leveling the attitude of the vehicle on the 8-ball. I was on the gauges in the cockpit doing that at the time the lunar contact light came on.
It's a nice place to land. Well, it sure was dusty, though. The good thing we leveled off high, and came down, because I sure couldn't see what was underneath us once I got into that dust. That went a long way, up onto the horizon.
Because of how drastically downgraded the visibility was during the landing, it had proven impossible from inside the LEM for Conrad or Bean to determine exactly where at Stadio Cognitium they had touched down. Conrad had been forced to finish the final approach with his eyes in the cockpit, so he had been unable during the final vertical descent phase to identify or track any known nearby lunar landmarks out the window that would have allowed him to roughly triangulate a more precise touchdown location for mission control by later referencing the overhead landing site grid maps the astronauts had on board. LMP Al Bean was also otherwise engaged during the landing, monitoring all the various spacecraft systems, and he claims he had no ability to sight see or triangulate out his window during the final descent at all. To make visibility matters worse, after landing and DPS engine shutdown, the early morning lunar downsun western-facing view of the Stadio Cognitium site that the astronauts were afforded through Intrepid's forward-facing plus Z-side windows was naturally washed of the majority of its visible contrast detail due to a phenomenon known as coherent backscatter. And in addition to coherent backscatter, this downsun scene was even further degraded due to another visual effect called shadow hiding, which meant that the astronauts in the LEM were viewing objects on the Lorraine to the west that were casting their shadows towards the zero phase point directly opposite the sun. So those surface shadows were actually hidden by the vertical objects or structuring responsible for casting them. What all this meant was that the west-facing view from the LEM windows after touchdown did not offer much in the way of positive discernible or identifiable visual clues to help Conrad and Bean pinpoint exactly where they had landed. Commander Conrad thought correctly that he had overshot Surveyor Crater on its north side to avoid the boulders in Pete's parking lot, and then came to his left or south slightly before landing, but Conrad later claimed he had no idea he had touched down as close to the rim of Surveyor Crater as he did. And unfortunately, Surveyor Crater, with the Surveyor 3 spacecraft on its eastern interior rim, was behind the LEM to the southeast and was totally hidden from the spacecraft window's limited field of view after landing. Now, there was one way for Conrad and Bean to best determine where they were after touchdown, and that was to conduct a stand-up EVA, which is precisely what they did covertly shortly after landing. Getting this high ground view from atop the LEM could prove invaluable for any manned landing on the moon, particularly in the case of Apollo 12, when we know the commander had to deal with visibility issues caused by dust that precluded him from getting a decent mental snapshot of the area from altitude as he made the final vertical descent. There are several reasons why it was very important that their precise landing point was identified prior to Conrad and Bean conducting their first moonwalk out on the lunar surface, and one of those reasons is that the pre-flight orbital recon cameras and radar systems whose datasets were analyzed and used to build the pre-flight topographical imagery and models of the landing site for simulation and training and other purposes before each Apollo mission suffered from an obvious limiting factor. That imagery was only as accurate as the maximum resolution of those remote sensing platforms that were used to gather the data. And because of that, getting an elevated perspective of the surrounding Lorraine from the highest point you could get to after landing, the roof of their lunar module Intrepid, could be absolutely vital to not only determining the exact location of the landing site on the grid map, but just as importantly, it could also be very helpful to the astronauts in detecting any other objects or areas of interest in the immediate surrounding area that, due to the undulating characteristics of the Lorraine, might otherwise be hidden from view to an astronaut's eye and may be missed entirely while he's out walking on the grounds level plains of regolith. These visual line-of-sight considerations in fact had a great deal to do with the reason why NASA publicly planned for and conducted a declared stand-up EVA during the Apollo 15 mission to Hadley Rill a year and a half after Apollo 12's covert stand-up EVA was carried out, because they knew that the unique perspective from over 7 meters up on the roof of the LEM would let the astronauts acquire that much sought-after elevated 360-degree view of the surrounding scene, so that they can not only pinpoint their exact touchdown location, but also get a fantastic initial look around at any areas of interest they may wish to visit during their upcoming moonwalk EVAs. During the Apollo 12 mission in particular, another very important reason that Mission Control needed to know exactly where Conrad and Bean had landed prior to conducting their first moonwalk had to do with astronaut safety. You have to keep in mind that Apollo 12 was only the second declared lunar landing ever, and it was going to be the first Apollo mission that would feature an actual moonwalk traverse away from the safety of the lunar module. A few months before Apollo 12, back during their single Apollo 11 moonwalk, the official historical record indicates that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin never ventured more than 70 meters or so from the security of their LEM lifeboat, always staying in the immediate vicinity of the lander. To illustrate this, here's a graphic showing the footpath movement of Armstrong and Aldrin during their Apollo 11 moonwalk, overlaid against an international football pitch. a 105 by 68 meter rectangle for scale and distance comparison. In contrast, Conrad and Bean were going to conduct not one, but two moonwalks during their 31.5-hour stay at Stadio Cognidium, and during the second excursion on day 2, they were going to venture over half a kilometer from their lunar module Intrepid. Experience from Apollo 11 and from previous unmanned lunar lander imagery datasets like those transmitted back to Earth by Surveyor 3 had already demonstrated that once down on the Lorraine, identifying lunar landmarks and calculating distances to unknown-size objects could be exceedingly difficult for an astronaut to do with any degree of accuracy.
When we first landed, I really thought that crater was like 1,000 feet away, but it's obviously a whale of a lot further than that away. But it looks like it's right next to us. You know how far away it is from us, and how difficult it is to judge distance.
Having a firm grasp of exactly where they touched down allowed the astronauts and mission control to reference the high-resolution nadir view grid maps they had on board, and depending on just where they calculated that the LEM had actually landed, adjust their scientific selenologic traverse and experiment deployment location plans accordingly. For each Apollo lunar landing mission, there were in fact multiple pre-flight contingency traverse plans drawn up just in case the LEM landed off target, ensuring that if the astronauts could identify exactly where they had touched down, they would still be able to determine their relationship to other areas of interest around the landing site, so that every traverse to a different location during the EVAs would still salvage a decent scientific return and produce profitable selenologic samples and photographic data. Because the Apollo 12 moonwalks were touted as featuring the very first traverses ever conducted on the moon, and because NASA only had the very brief and overtly cautious experience from the Apollo 11 crew to go on at that point, Mission Control wanted to be certain they knew exactly where Conrad and Bean were at all times. And because any visual triangulation attempts during the final approach and landing had been thwarted by regolith entrainment dust issues, the only way they could determine that vital location data prior to their first moonwalk was for the two astronauts to conduct an SEVA. Remember that NASA, at that stage of the Apollo program, were still uncertain how effectively or efficiently the astronauts would be able to move around in the lunar environment, and the space agency was uncertain as to how tired the astronauts may get or just how much water their PLIS backpacks would require to cool their A7L spacesuits during a walking traverse. One technical consideration that definitely came into play here is the fact that the Apollo-era PLIS backpacks in the RCU spacesuit monitoring system had no measurement or display capability to determine and show exactly how much cooling water had been expended or how much was remaining in the PLIS tanks. As complex as the PLIS life support backpacks were, the truth is that throughout the 6 Apollo lunar landing missions, the only way to determine that vital cooling data was for the astronauts to actually weigh their PLIS packs on a scale before and after the EVA to calculate the exact water weight loss that had occurred. Another technical consideration that further justified Conrad and Bean's SEVA had to do with determining the line-of-sight radio limitations of the astronauts' communication and telemetry systems while they were out on the lunar surface. Because our moon lacks an appreciable ionosphere to bounce radio signals off of, that meant that Conrad and Bean's communications radios in their PLIS backpacks needed to essentially remain within direct line of sight of the receiving antenna on top of the lunar module. During Apollo 12, when Conrad and Bean were conducting their moonwalks, their radio traffic with Mission Control was actually being relayed up and down through the LEM communication system. And because the Surveyor 3 lander was known to be located inside the rim of Surveyor Crater and was sitting several meters below the crater rim, there was a justifiable pre-mission concern that if the LEM was situated too far away from Surveyor Crater at touchdown, when Conrad and Bean descended into the crater to visit the Surveyor 3 spacecraft, they may lose line of sight with the LEM antenna and potentially lose radio communications with Mission Control. The SEVA they covertly conducted before the moonwalks alleviated those concerns, however. One more simple but powerful influence that played a role in NASA's decision to conduct this covert SEVA during Apollo 12 dealt with maximizing the propaganda benefits. The Apollo 12 mission took place during the heart of the Cold War in 1969, remember, and we know that prior to the flight, NASA had very publicly billed that mission as being a demonstration of the LEM's precision site targeting and touchdown capabilities. So conducting this SEVA covertly would let NASA maximize the positive propaganda if the landing was found to be on target, while also giving them a head start to begin mitigating any negative media fallout if the covert SEVA had revealed that they touched down too far away from the Surveyor 3 lander to make the traverse over to it like they had planned to do. So there really was no one single benefit that was used as the lone rationale for NASA to conduct this SEVA during Apollo 12. There were in fact a whole host of technical, scientific, safety, and propaganda benefits that when added together easily established the justification for doing it. For any Apollo crew to be able to covertly conduct this type of off-the-record operation during a mission without the public knowing about it would have to mean that NASA must have possessed some kind of technical capability that allowed Mission Control to carry out secret radio communications with the astronauts when they were in space or on the lunar surface. Unfortunately, many people still seem to be under the erroneous impression that the NASA archives offer the public a 100% complete and unedited record of all radio traffic between the astronauts and Mission Control during the Apollo program. And people think that because NASA over the decades has led you to believe that their lunar explorations had nothing to hide from the public and were entirely transparent, uncensored affairs. And that is simply not true. Just to quickly prove to you right now that this covert comms capability did exist and was employed during the Apollo program, we could take a quick look at a couple brief quotes from Apollo astronaut Eugene Cernan that he published in his autobiography, The Last Man on the Moon, where he blatantly admits to the existence and use of the private radio loop that let him secretly talk with Mission Control at least twice during his Apollo 17 mission to Taurus Littrow. Stripped down to our liquid-cooled underwear, we had a quick dinner, debriefed with the guys on Earth via a private radio loop, and played with some of the rocks we had stowed in the cabin boxes. In this next quote, Cernan describes another brief conversation over the radio that he had following the end of the second lunar surface EVA, and the conversation Cernan is referencing here was between himself and NASA's Director of Flight Crew Operations back at Mission Control, a man by the name of Deke Slayton. And Cernan was concerned here about the fact that prior to their flight, the Palestinian terrorist group Black September had actually made several threats towards the Apollo 17 mission and the astronauts' families, and with the recent Munich massacre at the 1972 Olympic Summer Games just a few months prior no doubt still in the back of his mind, Cernan wanted to make sure that his family was safe while he was on the moon. And here is how Cernan described this brief off-the-record radio conversation that he had with Deke Slayton. After we had some chow and settled down, Deke told me on a private radio loop that everything was fine at home. I talked to Barbara, and she said everything is okay, he said. Not a peep from Black September. An examination of the Apollo 17 lunar surface mission tapes and voice transcripts in the NASA Public Archives clearly demonstrates that these private radio conversations that Cernan describes in his autobiography were never officially recorded or transcribed onto the public record of the Apollo 17 mission. So we can state with certainty that these secret voice transmissions did happen and were deliberately censored by NASA and sanitized from the official public record entirely. The only reason we know that these conversations in fact did take place is because astronaut Gene Cernan openly admitted to it, confirming both the existence and use of this private radio loop during the Apollo program. Mission Control and the astronauts were obviously well aware that their primary radio voice communications channels were always being publicly monitored throughout the mission, so when they wanted to have an off-the-record secret conversation without the public ever knowing about it, they'd simply stop transmitting over the primary public voice radio loop and instead send the private voice communications traffic over one of the secondary and more secure radio channels that were normally being used to handle spacecraft telemetry and data transmissions. And one of the radio channels that was employed for this purpose during the Apollo program was the biomedical telemetry feed that normally was used to send things like real-time ECG data to the flight surgeon in Mission Control so he could remotely monitor the astronauts' vital signs. So, the covert radio voice traffic that NASA wanted to keep secret was concealed by piggybacking it onto one of the private biomedical or telemetry transmission channels, replacing the telemetry data stream they were normally uplinking with secret voice traffic instead. And these radio data channels used during the Apollo program were capable of transmitting either telemetry data streams or voice traffic if need be. And most importantly, those frequencies were not being closely monitored by the public at all. The truth is that the Apollo crews absolutely did have the capability to carry out entirely covert, totally off-the-record radio conversations with Mission Control while in space or on the lunar surface. This so-called private radio loop was used with regularity throughout the Apollo program, and during Apollo 12, astronauts Conrad and Bean certainly put this clandestine comms capability to good use both before and during their covert SEVA. The official timeline for Apollo 12 tells us that Conrad and Bean touchdown at Stadio Cognitium on November 19th, 1969, exactly 110 hours, 32 minutes, and 35 seconds after liftoff. Commander Pete Conrad officially descended the ladder and took his first steps on the lunar surface at an MET of 115 hours, 22 minutes, and 16 seconds. So there was a period of 4 hours, 49 minutes, and 41 seconds between the LEM landing on the moon and the commencement of their first declared lunar surface EVA. And we know from the 2006 Lunar Dust Management document that the COVERT stand-up EVA was conducted at some point during that almost 5-hour window of time. Because of the fact this SEVA was being kept off the public record, it was not going to be a long and drawn-out affair. The actual SEVA itself would take less than 20 minutes to carry out, just enough time for Conrad and Bean to get a quick look around from the roof of the LEM so they could determine their exact touchdown location, as well as no doubt shooting some classified photo panoramics of the scene with one of the 70mm Hasselblad still cameras they had on board. One of the early declared steps in the post-landing checklist after touchdown on the moon was for Conrad and Bean to program the LEM's computer by doing what was called a P57 platform alignment, which involved calculating gravity and star alignments by having the astronauts take several star sightings through the Alignment Optical Telescope, the AOT, in the LEM, and then transferring that 3-axis unit vector location data to the computer. I believe that the initial cover story that would allow Conrad and Bean to begin covert preparations for the SEVA began to be implemented around 37 minutes after landing. This was at a mission event time of around 111 hours and 7 minutes, and it was at this point in the official public record timeline that astronaut Pete Conrad made a radio transmission to Earth, reporting that they had accidentally entered a wrong number into the DISCI keypad when they were inputting the platform alignment data, and because of that, they decided they would have to redo the whole program again.
Forget it, Houston, I can do the program over again. All we want to do is get outside, that's all.
Intrepid Houston, simplest thing to do is do the program over.
We agree, bye-bye.
Okay.
It's important to note that there is no evidence allowing us to verify that this apparently accidental programming error that Conrad claimed to make ever really happened. It would be a simple lie NASA could use to create an alibi for the astronauts to let them start covert preparations for the SEVA over the private radio loop, while the public was thinking the astronauts' time was accounted for redoing the entire P57 platform alignment. It was immediately after Conrad made this radio call that a series of extended public radio channel communications breaks began taking place, full of minute upon minute of nothing but dead air heard over the public radio loop transmission coming from the lunar module. The first comm break of significance started at an MET of 111 hours, 9 minutes, 31 seconds, immediately after Conrad had claimed that he accidentally made the input error during the platform alignment. According to the official Apollo 12 TEC transcript evidence in the NASA archives, we are told that this particular comm break was a 9-minute and 3-second period of dead air, with the next radio communication with the astronauts on the lunar surface coming at an MET of 111 hours, 18 minutes, 34 seconds. If we go to the actual mission audio recordings from the Apollo 12 mission that are available in NASA's Apollo Lunar Surface Journal online archives, and not only listen to this particular dead air period, but actually time it on a stopwatch, you will not find a 9-minute and 3-second period of dead air like the transcript evidence suggests you should. The stopwatch tells us that the period of time in the actual archive audio file where there is no communications between the LEM and mission control is 12 minutes and 38 seconds. That's 3 minutes and 35 seconds longer than what the official mission transcript claims this comm break should be. The reason for this discrepancy here is because this Apollo archive audio evidence has been edited and spliced, as well as sanitized and censored, so that today the public do not always get to hear a complete and 100% accurate audio representation of what was really going on during the Apollo lunar explorations. Shortly after this comm break, there were 2 more dead air periods totaling over 8.5 minutes, and all this led up to when the covert SEVA was actually conducted, beginning at an MET of 111 hours, 39 minutes, 57 seconds. At the time the covert SEVA was beginning, Conrad and Bean had already been on the moon inside Intrepid for almost an hour and 10 minutes, yet they had still not provided, at least not over the public radio loop, a proper visual description of Stadio Cognitium by looking out the forward-facing windows on the LEM and reporting what they saw to Mission Control. It's been 67 minutes and 22 seconds since they landed, but Conrad and Bean have yet to publicly describe what their landing site looks like from up close. It's also worth noting that in the time between the LEM landing on the moon and the beginning of their covert SEVA over an hour later, there is nothing in the official mission transcript evidence to suggest that Conrad and Bean had taken their pressure gloves or pressure helmets off. They are still in their pressurized spacesuits and are still directly connected to the LEM's environmental control system via the life support hosing. And the only reason for that is because they needed to stay in that suit configuration in order to conduct the covert SEVA. Just prior to the covert SEVA commencing, the following exchange over the public radio loop took place between Capcom Jerry Carr and Apollo 12 Commander Pete Conrad, with Carr telling Conrad that they had apparently finally finished the platform alignment.
Intrepid Houston, the computer's yours.
Roger.
You have a new RLS and state vector.
Thank you.
Immediately after Conrad says the words "thank you," this is followed by an extended and rather bizarre dead air period of 18 minutes and 45 seconds, where there is absolutely nothing heard from the two astronauts on the lunar surface over the public radio loop. You can confirm this in the official Apollo 12 mission audio file in the NASA archives, a waveform analysis of which we're looking at right now. The area you see highlighted in blue here is covering the full dead air period. This is where Conrad and Bean were actually conducting the covert stand-up EVA. And just to clarify, the waveform spikes that you see occurring within this time frame, highlighted in yellow here, are not due to communications from the lunar surface. Those waveforms are denoting radio voice traffic between Mission Control and the third astronaut, Command Module pilot Dick Gordon, who you will remember was actually on orbit above the moon in the Command Service Module, call sign Yankee Clipper, while Conrad and Bean were down on the lunar surface.
Yankee Clipper Houston, the CMC's yours.
Roger, Jimmy, thank you. How are things going on the surface?
They're doing great, Dick.
The area here you see highlighted in red is not due to any voice traffic, but rather is comprised of nothing but bursts of static coming in over the public radio loop for several seconds. Communications between the LEM and Mission Control do not resume until an MET of 111 hours, 58 minutes, and 43 seconds. And it's worth noting that while the official mission transcript evidence claims that this extended communications break is 18 minutes and 45 seconds in duration, if we take a stopwatch to the official mission audio file, it actually reveals this dead air period to be a little longer than that. It's in fact 18 minutes and 51 seconds long. We can look at the lunar surface mission events timeline book that was carried aboard the LEM during Apollo 12, so we can see what the astronauts were officially scheduled to be doing while that almost 19-minute period of communications blackout over the public radio loop was taking place. The area highlighted in blue here is showing the full segment of dead air along the mission timeline, and you can see that during that segment of time, the astronauts were officially supposed to be describing and photographing the lunar surface over the public radio loop. All the public got to hear during that period was dead air, though. The fact is, Conrad and Bean were describing stadiocognitum and were taking photographs during this public blackout period, but they were doing it secretly over the private radio loop while conducting their covert SEVA. The two astronauts did not begin to give their actual site description over the public radio loop until after their covert SEVA had ended. So during this 18-minute and 51-second window of dead air time, astronauts Conrad and Bean were actually covertly conducting their stand-up EVA, using the private radio loop to communicate with Houston, while the public heard absolutely nothing at all from the lunar surface. When communications with Intrepid resumes after this nearly 19-minute period, we hear the voice of a new Capcom in Houston, who during the break had taken over from Capcom Jerry Carr. And this new Capcom was a man by the name of Dr. Edward Gibson, who interestingly had been officially designated as the EVA Capcom for Apollo 12. And because of that, it logically makes sense that he would have been the Capcom NASA would have used during the covert SEVA. So it is not really a shock that immediately following that off-the-record extravehicular activity, he was the Capcom that came on the air over the public radio loop instead of Jerry Carr. Have a listen to the very first communication that took place between Mission Control and the LEM after the covert SEVA had been completed.
Intrepid, Houston.
Go ahead.
Well done, Intrepid. You got a bunch of happy geologists in the back room waiting to go. Say, we're standing by with a LEM consumables update and also standing by for your description.
Hey, we were just working on that, and I'm very close to where I want to be, but I'm trying to pin it down exactly.
There are several interesting things about this particular conversation that make a lot of sense if you consider the fact that they just carried out a covert SEVA. You initially hear Capcom Ed Gibson say the words,
"Well done, Intrepid."
And this is a kind of odd opening line for him to use, since it's been 18 minutes and 51 seconds since Conrad and Bean had acknowledged doing anything over the public radio loop. What Gibson is actually doing there is congratulating them for having conducted their covert SEVA successfully. You will also notice that Conrad never acknowledges that he is now suddenly talking to a new Capcom in Houston, and this is because the Capcom changeover actually took place at the start of the dead air period, switching to Ed Gibson, the designated EVA Capcom, at the beginning of the covert SEVA, and this means that Conrad and Bean had already been talking with Gibson for 19 minutes over the private radio loop, so that's why Conrad or Bean never acknowledged that this is a new voice they're hearing from Houston. You then hear Gibson say,
"You got a bunch of happy geologists in the back room waiting to go."
Those happy geologists that Gibson is referencing here are the NASA astrogeology team in Houston, guys like Ray Batson and Gordon Swan, who at the time were in the Apollo SSR, the Science Support Room in Building 30 at Mission Control. And they would have definitely been listening in on the private radio loop while Conrad and Bean had, just minutes before, covertly described the Stadio Cognitium site from the roof of the LEM. So this geology back room was justifiably excited by the covert descriptions they just heard. On a related note, here is a quote from Apollo 15 Commander Dave Scott, who we know conducted a declared stand-up EVA during his July 1971 mission to Hadley Rill. And this is how Scott responded when he was asked about whether the 360-degree view from the roof of the spacecraft was significantly better than the view through the western-facing +Z forward windows inside the LEM. And I'll quote Scott directly here. "Oh yeah, without a doubt. The windows are very restrictive. And the SEVA, boy, that was a rush. To be able to stand there and just look at all that stuff, I mean, that was just a mind-blower to be able to just stand up there and gaze around and report what you saw, knowing full well that the Lee Silvers and the Gordon Swans and the guys in the back room are listening to every word." The next thing that Capcom Ed Gibson says over the radio during his initial exchange with the LEM is also rather telling.
"Say, we're standing by with a LEM consumables update."
The LEM consumables that Gibson is specifically referencing here are the oxygen reserves in the Lunar Module O2 tanks. Now, importantly, Conrad and Bean never reported the LEM oxygen tank reserve levels to Houston after landing at Stadio Cognitium before their covert SEVA. LMP Al Bean's only comment about the O2 level after landing was that it was, quote, good.
That's an extendable look good at 2H2O.
And because they had to depressurize the LEM immediately before the covert SEVA and then repressurize it immediately after using oxygen from those onboard tanks, that repress would have depleted the O2 consumables levels aboard the spacecraft a little bit. So Houston required those levels to be immediately updated after the SEVA, which is precisely what happened. The Capcom then mentions that Mission Control is now standing by for Conrad and Bean to finally provide a verbal description of the Stadio Cognitium landing site.
"And also standing by for your description."
Keep in mind, Conrad and Bean have been on the moon now for over an hour and 26 minutes, yet they have still not given an initial description of their landing site to Houston, at least not over the public radio loop so the world could hear it. Conrad then responds to this by saying the following.
"I'm very close to where I want to be, but I'm trying to pin it down exactly."
Conrad is looking at the LSE map set of the landing site that they have on board and is trying to pinpoint the exact landing spot so he can give an accurate map grid reference to Mission Control, now that he's secretly seen the full 360-degree scene from the roof of the LEM during the covert SEVA they just carried out. 3 minutes later, Conrad actually does provide a very accurate LSE grid reference to Mission Control, pinpointing where they actually touched down, something he was not able to do before the covert SEVA was carried out. When the two astronauts were later providing their verbal descriptions of the landing site to Mission Control over the public radio loop, they tried to keep those descriptions censored to make sure that they only referenced things that they could see from the limited field of view that they had out the +Z side windows inside the LEM, which was the only view they were officially supposed to have had of the site at that point. But when LMP Al Bean was describing his visual impressions, he seems to twice reference the fact that he's already seen the site in all directions.
You can see quite far in all directions. Blocky rim craters, they're visible in almost every direction.
We know that this stand-up EVA had not been a part of the publicized pre-mission flight plan, so the fact was it was simply not a part of the Apollo 12 public script. And make no mistake, the Apollo missions were heavily scripted, highly censored affairs. What the public has been told about those amazing missions to the moon was merely a sanitized, censored version of what was really going on, what was really being said, and what was really being seen and filmed up there.
Man, you talk about a mysterious-looking place. They can cut some parts of those pictures out and make a nice photograph.
Apollo 11 astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, has actually given an interview where he confirmed that certain segments of his Apollo mission were indeed carefully scripted to control exactly what the public saw and heard. Back in 2003, Aldrin was interviewed for Neil Armstrong's only authorized biography, and during that interview, he was asked about whether some of the live television transmissions that were made from the CSM during the flight really were improvised and unscripted. And in response, Aldrin first admits that NASA, quote, went to great lengths, unquote, to make sure that they appeared unscripted. And he then goes on to say the following, and I'll quote Aldrin directly here. The fact is, they were carefully planned in advance, and for me, the exact words were written down on little cards stuck onto the panel in front of us. During the Apollo program, the moonwalking astronauts wore a small booklet that was attached to the wrist of their spacesuit, designed to serve as a quick reference timeline and scheduled lunar surface operations checklist. And here are the last 2 pages from Apollo 12 Commander Pete Conrad's actual flown EVA wrist cuff checklist that he wore during his 2 moonwalks. This pair of pages, obviously written before the mission and easily accessible to him while on the lunar surface, were clearly meant to provide Conrad with pre-scripted, already sanitized geologic or selenologic phrasing suggestions, reminding him to keep any descriptions he gives over the public radio loop censored so they focus on geologic aspects only. And there is no other reason for Conrad to have sanitized script notes describing his landing site in his checklist during these moonwalks. So there were indeed sanitizing methods or pre-planned scripting that was going on during the Apollo program to help control exactly what the public saw and heard. And this kind of censorship during those lunar missions happened a lot more than most people are aware. We're just scratching the surface of that subject here. It's very important for the public to be aware that NASA absolutely had national security obligations during the Apollo program that they were legally forced to adhere to. The space agency adopted a very broad interpretation of Presidential Executive Order 10501 during the Apollo program, meaning that during those lunar explorations, NASA could be and was legally forced to conceal from the public certain things about those missions in what had been determined by a very select group of insiders to be in the best interest of global security and stability. The primary secret the Apollo program was tasked with hiding is, without hyperbole, the biggest secret of them all. The fact that evidence of intelligent extraterrestrial life had been discovered on the moon and was being covertly investigated as a secret part of those supposedly public Apollo missions. During Apollo 12, Conrad and Bean were ordered to carry out their SEVA covertly using the private radio loop because that would allow them to provide Houston with totally uncensored verbal descriptions of what they could really see, looking in all directions from the very unique high ground vantage point afforded to them from the roof of their lunar module. Keeping the SEVA covert also would have allowed them to shoot some very revealing photographs, and potentially also take some 16mm motion picture footage with the DAC camera they also had on board the LEM. And since that imagery does not officially exist, the NASA censors never needed to expend the resources sanitizing it for the public, because those photographs would never appear in the Apollo 12 public mission archives anyway. This would certainly not be the first or the last time that NASA publicly denied the existence of imagery shot during a mission in order to try to keep the public deaf, dumb, and blind to it. I can prove that NASA has engaged in this kind of photographic censorship in the past because they've been caught doing it, and I'll give you an example right now. 6 months after the flight of Apollo 15, NASA published their official and supposedly complete index of 70mm photographs from that mission, with this 360-page archive document declaring that 18 separate magazines, comprising a total of 2,624 individual frames, were exposed during that flight. This photo index catalog declares that the 18 film magazines from Apollo 15 were given the catalog designator numbers labeled from 81 through to 99. However, you will notice that there is one film magazine that's conspicuously absent from this list. According to this official NASA photo index published in 1972, There was no film magazine number 83 exposed during the Apollo 15 mission. NASA have literally omitted any mention of a magazine 83 from this entire 360-page document, with the index instead just leapfrogging from magazine number 82 straight to number 84 with no explanation given. The inarguable fact is that for over 3 decades, NASA denied that there was a film magazine number 83 from Apollo 15, with all of their public archive documentation seeming to demonstrate that this roll of film, which we know would have contained 200 exposures of 70mm black and white film stock, simply did not exist. However, that lie came apart and was finally exposed over 30 years after the Apollo 15 mission, when the NASA LPI Apollo Image Atlas online archive first published their low-resolution thumbnail catalog of Apollo imagery on the internet. And miraculously, with no explanation given and with no supporting documentation at all to account for it, this official NASA online archive now not only references the existence of a magazine number 83 from Apollo 15, but it also acknowledges that this 200-shot roll of film contained at least 17 exposures that were originally taken at undetermined times and locations during that mission. So there is no debating the fact that for years the existence of this film magazine was concealed from the public entirely. It took over 3 decades after Apollo 15 for NASA to finally come clean and acknowledge in their LPI online archive that at least 17 frames from magazine number 83 actually do exist. And keep in mind, we have absolutely no way of confirming whether it is true that only 17 exposures in total actually were taken on Mag 83. For all we know, the entire 200 shots from that magazine may very well have been exposed in space or on the lunar surface during Apollo 15, and NASA has only shown the public the worst 17 frames of the bunch some 3 decades after the fact. So it is an entirely justifiable question for the public to ask, just how many other film magazines from the Apollo program have never been released for the world to see? The photographs that definitely would have been exposed during the Apollo 12 covert SEVA certainly have never seen the light of day. Sadly, the public really got screwed on the visual evidence from Apollo 12, because not only were we deliberately denied the imagery that was taken during the covert SEVA, but due to what the official historical record claims was an apparent accident with the TV camera very early on during Conrad and Bean's first moonwalk, the world was also denied almost 7.5 hours of color television footage evidence from that mission that obviously would have shown us a lot of stadiocognitum. If there were things up there that NASA did not want the public to see, as I am certainly asserting that there were, then conveniently having the camera break at the very start of the first EVA goes a long way to help hiding those classified things. When those brave Apollo astronauts journeyed across the cislunar void to visit our moon, the reality of what really went on up there was far more incredible and decidedly more astounding than the public record has ever been officially allowed to acknowledge. We must always remember that the cold, hard truth is that NASA have never had any legal duty whatsoever to tell the public the full, uncensored truth about anything that they discovered or did during those amazing lunar explorations. The space agency was, however, assigned broad national security legal obligations that they absolutely were forced to adhere to during the Apollo era, obligations that without question could require the space agency to lie to you and cover up evidence under the guise of maintaining global security and stability. In addition to examining the technical aspects of just how a stand-up EVA was conducted, we've confirmed that during Apollo 12, severe blowing dust issues during final descent had left Conrad and Bean unable to pinpoint their exact touchdown location after landing, and we know that fact established a host of compelling technical, scientific, safety, and even propaganda reasons that would have justified NASA doing everything they could to determine exactly where the 2 astronauts had touched down prior to allowing them to wander over half a kilometer away from the safety of the LEM during what was going to be the very first ever moonwalk traverses in the history of the Apollo program. Additionally, you've seen the official mission transcripts and heard the NASA archive audio evidence from Apollo 12 that offer up segments where there's nothing but minute upon minute of dead air over the public radio loop, sometimes more dead air than the official NASA transcript timeline acknowledges there should be, which provided the astronauts ample time to covertly prepare for this clandestine activity, including one extended public channel dead air period that was 18 minutes and 51 seconds in duration, occurring exactly at the time I'm telling you Conrad and Bean were actually conducting this covert stand-up EVA, exactly at the time they were officially supposed to be publicly describing and photographing their landing site. There is also no question that a covert comms capability, the so-called private radio loop, that would have been required for NASA to pull this SEVA off secretly, did exist and was employed during the Apollo program. And you have seen that it certainly would not be unprecedented for the space agency to censor any imagery that was exposed during this covert operation and keep it off the public record entirely. Here today you have seen proof that NASA absolutely had the means, motive, and opportunity to do something as ambitious and secretive as carrying out an entirely clandestine extravehicular activity while on the moon without the public ever knowing about it. And you don't have to take just my word for it either, because most importantly, in addition to all the other evidence we've examined in this presentation, keep in mind you have seen official NASA documentation here where the space agency has blatantly admitted that what I am saying is the truth, that back in November of 1969, astronauts Pete Conrad and Al Bean absolutely did conduct a covert stand-up EVA during their Apollo 12 mission to Stadio Cognition.